Let's start. Good morning. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar. My name is Carmen Boone, Education Coordinator from Oregon Pacific Area Health Education Center. We're a hosted agency of Samaritan Lebanon Community Hospital. Our agency mission is to promote access to quality healthcare through community and educational partnerships. Today, I will be your host and moderator. Let's go over some housekeeping items. Please mute your microphones during the session. There are moments where you'll be asked to share with us, so you please unmute your microphone during those moments. You will receive a copy of the slides after this webinar. You may use the chat box for questions or comments at any time. You will be able to access the recording of this webinar going to our YouTube channel. Today on that email that we will send you, you will have directions and the link to our YouTube channel, as well as information on how to retrieve your CME or CE or attendance certificate. If you have any questions, please email me at the address that you see on your screens. To obtain CME, CE credit or contact hours or a certificate of attendance, you must log into eeds.com. It's www.eeds.com and enter this activity code. Please write it down and consider that the activity code expires in 1 week. Again, we will email you these instructions and the link today. This presentation is jointly provided by Samaritan Health Services, Oregon AHEC, Oregon Health and Science University, and Oregon Pacific AHEC. The presenters and the planners of this activity report that they have no conflict of interest or relevant financial relationships with any commercial entities that might affect the contents of this presentation. And this webinar is presented by Drs. Tina Renian and John Fleischman, and they are both clinical psychologists with backgrounds in academic medicine and integrated behavioral health. Through their work as directors of behavioral health programs in family medicine residencies, they identified a need for better mental health and well-being support for clinicians. In 2020, they founded 10 Health to focus on providing specialized and accessible mental health care to healthcare professionals. 10 Health offers mental health care in 9 states, including Oregon and Washington. They are passionate about clinician well-being and consult with healthcare organizations to improve well-being and reduce barriers to care. Now, without further ado, I leave you with Tina and John.
Thanks so much, Carmen. Good morning, good early morning to all of you. I'm starting to feel like through the rhythm of this that we're kind of becoming a little community that meets every few weeks to talk about what we feel like are important topics in different ways. And today is talking about self-compassion with a practice lab. I know we are a small group, and so the practice lab is a very different experience than a didactic presentation. So hopefully you came ready and able to engage and participate to make this a valuable experience for each of you. Joan and I are happy to be here with you and happy to spend this time going over some content, but also engaging in dialogue through either direct dialogue. You can unmute yourself as the time calls and go on camera, or through the chat. And so it would also, just to start, be really helpful through the chat to just have a sense of kind of who's here and what your role is, if you're willing to put that in the chat as we just move towards a couple little introductory things. So just to get us started, we are going to be talking about self-compassion. We are going to be actually really more of a practice of self-compassion today with a couple of reminders. And so we are on the last in our phase 1 series here. We did a series of talks and practice labs that included these various content areas. And so we're down here at the last one on March 25th, Self-Compassion of Practice Lab. We do have another series of 6, 3 lectures, 3 practice labs planned. So stay tuned for that announcement and registration. We hope you will continue to join us for those. As Carmen intimated, we don't have any conflict of interest or anything to disclose. We at Tend Health do provide mental health and well-being services to individuals and organizations, and are happy to do that with or for any of you individually or organizationally, but we are not here selling anything today other than an experience and a time to be with you to begin to learn and practice these skills. So with this format, you'll notice it's also a different format than just kind of the standard webinar-based presentation. So if you can have your camera on, we would love that. Or certainly if you're going to engage with us, to have your camera on, that's really helpful to just begin to create a sense of connection and community. If you want to let us know kind of your name, how you prefer to be referred to, you can change your name in your Zoom screen just by clicking where your name appears in the bottom left corner. You can click on that and change your name, or go to the 3 little dots in the right hand corner of your Zoom square and change your name, include your pronouns if you are willing, and maybe your organization if that gets to be a very long name, but whatever you want to put in there would be helpful. We ask, like Carmen said, to mute your mic when you're not speaking. And as we go through dialogue and perhaps get some conversation going, just a reminder not to share any protected health information in this space. And that we want people to engage and feel open to sharing, and also to know that, as best you can, kind of take the lessons and leave the stories, and that we all learn through this process of sharing, and we all learn best by making some of these conceptual things come alive, moving from the theoretical to the tangible and the actionable. And so we really do invite that inquiry and that dialogue. So I will just pause there. Joan, anything I'm missing in our kind of intro and setup that you want to add? Yeah. Okay, great. I just want to, I'm actually going to stop screen sharing just for a moment, because I can't simultaneously look at the chat, and I'm just kind of curious to see who we have here. Welcome, Carrie from Bend, and Christy, Community Health Service Worker. Great. And if anyone else is willing to just sort of say what their role is, that helps us just be able to get a sense of that. So, okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen again and start with just a brief little reminder. If you were at the self-compassion lecture or watched it subsequent to the presentation, this will be a reminder to you. And if you have not, that's okay. We'll kind of hit the main points before we get into the time to practice. And when I think about self-compassion, oftentimes I'm met with some resistance to this for a variety of different reasons, but sometimes people feel like, well, sometimes people use this sense of I'm being self-compassion, and it feels like a cover for being selfish, for not responding to others' needs and just sort of meeting one's own needs. And when I think about self-compassion, I really think about it much more as an internal experience and an internal way of being, rather than always things that you can see objectively in terms of behavior. And so the question that I come to when I think about self-compassion is really, how would it be to meet the parts of ourselves that we either chronically or intermittently see as failing, how would it be to meet those parts of us in the same way that we meet the parts of us that we feel like are succeeding or doing well? So if we do something well, if we have a win, how do we meet that in ourselves? And what might it be like to meet ourselves in that same way when things don't go as planned or as expected or hoped? Whether it's because of things outside of our control or even things within our control, i.e., we make a mistake, we forget something, we bumble something. How would it be to actually meet ourselves in those moments in the same way that we meet ourselves when we nail it? So that's really what I think about when I think about self-compassion, much less about I'm being self-compassionate and I'm not responding to anybody's texts or anybody's emails. I'm being self-compassionate and I, am creating a lot of, self-care activities for myself that ignore anybody else's needs around me. I don't think about it in that way, and sometimes I find that presenting it in that sense as an internal experience can actually resolve a little bit of the defensiveness around it, but not all. So we'll dive into that. Just a brief reminder about, I'm not presenting here, sorry, about what compassion is. And compassion, we all probably instinctively know, and we probably have words to describe what that's like in our own bodies when we are experiencing compassion. And that is that really it's a basic kindness that for many people is emergent and sometimes spontaneously emerges in the face of suffering. When we become aware of suffering, oftentimes there is a spontaneous emergence of kindness or something that is known as compassion that we can identify. And we might be able to identify it as a physiological experience of kind of a warmth or an expansion. We might identify it as a behavioral experience, sort of a leaning in or a moving towards. We might identify it, in our vocalizations. There's a lot of different ways we can know that kindness that emerges. And it's that desire to alleviate that suffering in some small way. That is the definition of compassion. Different than empathy that might have a sense of a shared experience or you feel that emotional resonance with somebody. But empathy as a concept sort of stops there, whereas compassion couples a desire and perhaps efforts to alleviate that suffering in some way. So it's sort of that next step beyond empathy, if you will. And I'll just pause here, any questions or comments just about that concept of compassion, that definition of compassion? And you can unmute or chat in. Looks like I can see the chat this way. Does that definition resonate with folks?
I'm curious about what your thoughts are around how curiosity plays into compassion.
Yeah. So I think it's a really essential way of doing that last piece of compassion, of this desire to relieve the suffering. And without curiosity, our efforts to relieve suffering can be misaligned, right? It can be what we think is what is needed to alleviate suffering may not, in fact, be what is most helpful or useful for the person. And so to be able to resist kind of impulsively moving towards that action to relieve for others or even for ourselves, be able to stand in curiosity so that what is called for is the clarity in what is called for is there. And in healthcare, human services, Sometimes it's very evident what is needed, right? If somebody's IV has fallen out of their arm and there's something happening and there's distress there, it might be very obvious. You don't want to really stand in curiosity of like, oh, how can I be helpful here? You're going to respond. But there's a lot of other instances in which it's not so evident, or what we think might alleviate suffering might be off the mark a little bit, or it might be a helpful short-term solution that isn't so helpful in the long term. And a really good example of that is really in healthcare, of how often we feel pulled to fix, and we feel pulled to just sort of make the suffering go away. And that can undermine somebody's autonomy, that can undermine somebody's sense of empowerment, or what we think is the fix is actually not what is most helpful for a person. I was talking with somebody who was in a role working for what is in Oregon called a collaborative care, a CCO, a collaborative care organization. We call them accountable care organizations here on the East Coast. And they were working with somebody who was using the emergency room a lot for care, and the desire to fix, or the solution to the problem at the higher level is like, stop having them go to the emergency room. Well, when you get a little more granular, they were using the emergency room because it was the closest to them, didn't require them to pay for transportation, didn't require them to take off work and then not get paid to be able to receive services, and wasn't able to connect with a service that could meet their needs in a timely way at the times that they were available. And so this effort to alleviate suffering by shutting down the option of going to the emergency room was actually not what was called for, and not what was going to be most helpful for that person on the surface. There are kind of a lot of other workarounds. And to see that real conflict there when we're not curious to start about why that person might be doing what they're doing, and to really stand in a space of, particularly with regard to helping others, to stand in that space of inquiry and questioning, so that what might feel like the way to alleviate suffering from our perspective is actually grounded in that shared experience, so that we can listen for what's really called for and not just be reflexive in fixing it. Does that answer your question, Joan? And I welcome any other comments about that.
So Tina, this is Dorothy from Spokane, Washington. I do recovery, the state opioid response.
Great.
So I have that every day, the difference between compassion and empathy, and trying to fix it, because I have people in various stages of recovery and currently using or not using. And so your immediate response to me, or I do, is like, let's fix it, instead of, stepping back for just a minute. And I have like 200 clients. So I have 3 other staff, but it's really that impulse of the day when they show up at your door and they're in crisis mode, and they're either having mental health issues, or they're actually using to the point where you really need to get medical involved. And so, yeah, it's definitely an everyday, am I trying to fix it right away and not step in where I don't need to step in? Does this person really need my empathy, my compassion, or just need us, listen, step back? But definitely my clients are definitely in every area. They can be on a MAP program, or they can just be right off the street. So it's every day is different. So sometimes it's hard to separate yourself, or it is for me, of working in the moment.
Yeah.
Because it changes every day. It's never the same. It's like people just show up all the time. So, but yes, I understand. I agree with that.
Well, and that's, Dorothy, like, sometimes the action itself can come from very different, it may be the same action, but it can come from different places, right? And so the action may be the same, but if it's coming from that place of sort of discernment, or kind of like you said, sort of stepping back. I'm reminded of Rachel Naomi Remen, who is physician kind of at the cross section, I think, of humanism and medicine. She says, there's three ways to view the world. You can view it as your role is to fix, to help, or to serve. And if you're viewing the world like your job is to fix, that implies that you see it as broken. If it's to help, it implies that you see it or people as weak. But if it's to serve, you already sort of see them as whole, and you are coming alongside and serving them in the way that's going to be most useful at that moment. And so the behavior may be the same, right?
Right.
And so asking that question, what will best serve in this moment?
But I agree with that in that fact that I came out of retirement 2 years ago to do the opioid response program. And so I've worked healthcare for 40 years prior to that, and always worked healthcare. So it gave me a different kind of viewpoint of, like you say, where am I at? Do I consider them, all my clients are working. Some of them have been 2 years on a program with me. Some of them have done exceptionally well, gotten their kids back, gotten their jobs back, are now stable people in our community, and are working. But had not we come alongside of them and let them guide them and not make those decisions always for them, you can see that difference. Definitely in that coming alongside is what really needs to be done, and not, because we can't make them change. We can only help them and guide them in that way.
Yeah,
But,
I love that word guide. I think that's really, because it does mean you have a little more, you perhaps have a little something different in your line of sight. You have a little, more clarity perhaps available to you because you're not in the mud at the same way. So I love that concept. It fits very well around being of service and guiding. That's lovely.
Yeah. So definitely in the service mode.
Yeah. Well, clearly to propel yourself out of retirement to be of use in this way is really admirable. Thank you for.
Well, I'm in long-term recovery, so I think it's helping people in recovery and addiction is I can walk alongside them because I know what they've gone through, and maybe not to some of the degree of the addiction that we have now, but definitely sometimes I have people who, and I invest in them, and that's what I tell them from the very beginning. I'm invested in you. I'm invested in long-term, recovery and what you're doing, because it's a journey. It's not happening overnight. It's a long-term. And I think, and I preach this a lot because I talk a lot about addiction. So, and I tell my clients that I'm here and I will be your biggest advocate and I will be your biggest cheerleader, but I can't do it for you, and I can help you in any way, but I won't let you, just tell me things that I know that are untrue that you're doing. I can't do that either, so I have to be like that staunch supporter and the really, holding them or expecting them to do their own responsibility.
And that's really, that is an act of compassion, right? Because it is being invested in their own empowerment and their own autonomy, which ultimately is the only thing that is going to sustain them in long-term recovery.
Yeah, it doesn't happen overnight. Definitely not.
And there's a question in here from Carrie in the chat that I want to just address. Is the question about how are sort of empathy and compassion the same thing, or are they different? And so they are interrelated, but they are distinct. And so empathy is really that quality of being in resonance with somebody and to essentially know and perhaps feel emotionally and maybe even somatically in your body, feel what somebody is feeling. It's that classic step into somebody else's shoes. And so empathy is really about a lot of this first part of compassion, which is this deep awareness and understanding of somebody else's experience. And we can do that from a cognitive perspective, an emotional perspective, and even a somatic perspective. And that can be really, really useful for somebody feeling seen and feeling heard and feeling understood. And we all probably know that experience ourselves, when we feel like somebody really gets it. That's a display of empathy, and that in and of itself is invaluable as a healing tool. As healers, however, as clinicians, there is a bit of a shadow side to empathy, because when you are faced with so much of your work encountering people in some level of distress or anxiety or suffering, you are called to do that work, hour after hour after hour in your day. And that is not light work. That has a pretty heavy kind of demand on a human being to sort of sit in presence with somebody else. And for people who are deeply empathetic, as many caregivers are, when you cognitively, emotionally, and somatically join with somebody else in suffering, it is as though you are truly feeling with them, feeling what they are feeling. And in fact, the neuroscience would suggest that, if you are doing that with somebody who is in distress, the parts of your brain that will show activity under a functional MRI are the same parts of your brain that are showing activity when you are in pain, when you are in physical pain. Because in fact, there is a pain associated with that feeling in terms of the empathy. So there is this phenomenon of empathetic distress, right? That you are actually kind of in the hole with somebody, if you will. And that can be very helpful for building rapport and building that resonance. But if that's a place where you are repeatedly and you don't have what I would call sort of the companion skill of compassion, what can happen is, because we feel so distressed ourselves, our systems propel us out of that distress, and it can very much propel us into either turning away from the pain or diving very strongly into fixing, because we're partly attempted to alleviate our own distress. And so we can very quickly step out of that curiosity of what is called for right now into a very reflexive fix. So empathy is very helpful for being able to be compassionate, but they are quite distinct. And compassion really holds that feeling for. And I love that question, Joan, around curiosity, because it's like feeling for with curiosity and a desire to alleviate, so that I'm not just compelled to fix or turn away from, but I'm compelled to learn more, to understand, and then to do what small part might be called for me to be in service. And what we know when people are in a state of compassion under functional MRI, it is a very different part of your brain that is active, and it's the part of your brain that is also active in moments when you're feeling love and connection and happiness. And so as a clinician, to be able to stand in compassion throughout your day is actually highly protective, related to your own well-being, rather than being sort of drug along in the empathetic mud, if you will. So Carrie, does that address your question? You can let me know off screen or in the chat. It does address your question. Great. Okay. I hope that's helpful for people. So now if we turn this again, sort of what is it like to meet myself in these times? If we turn it towards ourself, self-compassion really is an internal experience that is characterized by these same elements of being aware of suffering in oneself. That's the mindfulness component of knowing, oh, there's suffering here. This is really hard. A sense of common humanity, the idea that suffering is universal. None of us get through this human life experience without it. I might feel alone in this moment, and I am not alone. That to wish for or envision a life without suffering means to be so cut off from the human experience that you actually couldn't experience joy or excitement or any of the things on the positive valence. So to be able to have this sense of common humanity around suffering exists. And then a spirit of self-kindness. How can I be with and for myself because I am suffering? So that's what the spirit of self-compassion is about. It's that same quality of how we are with other people that we bring to ourselves. And then, so most people conceptually can be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, but it's really hard because there's an internal voice that is often there that is pushing us, propelling us for other things. And oftentimes we hold on to that inner critic that's not very compassionate because we believe that it's serving us. We believe that it motivates us, or it ensures that I get things done. It makes me a better person. And this is where it's really helpful to actually give the inner critic some space and some time to say, what role are you playing in my life? So I'd love to hear from people, either again, unmuting or in the chat. What does your inner critic, what is it trying to do for you? How is your inner critic trying to serve you? Well, nobody has an inner critic. All right. That's amazing. There is one. Let's see. There's something in the chat. Ah, Joan.
That's me.
This can be really tough to sort of, you know, be able to to look inward and be honest and say like, oh, what is my inner critic? What is my inner critic doing? Another way to think about it, if you're having trouble kind of answering this, is, you know, what do you typically criticize yourself for? And what do you say about yourself? Hey, sorry. This can really reveal what the goal of your inner critic is when you start to look at what it's saying. Yeah, so how can I help? Am I good enough? That's a, yeah, am I good enough? And the inner critic is often a voice that says like, I have to be vigilant. I can't let my guard down because I'm here to make you a good person. Oops. Yeah, if I make a mistake, people will not think I'm competent. As though, right, so if I do 100 great things, that's expected. If I do one mistake, people might think I'm not competent. And so again, this vigilance, the critic saying like, am I doing the right thing? Constantly self-assessing, constantly monitoring and seeing if you're doing the right thing or the good enough thing. Yeah. Sometimes the inner critic is really familiar in that, you know, there's repeated things that it will that it will say. So like it might be that, you know, always or never, or a label, a statement about yourself that seems so sweeping and universal. And maybe even to the point of ridiculous, but it doesn't keep the critic from serving it up, right? Things like, you're an idiot, or, you know, I'm an idiot, I'm incompetent, I'm always screwing things up, those kinds of things. And these are not necessarily things you say out loud. These are the quiet, private things that don't really, that nobody else hears. But that radio station sort of is, you know, is kind of constantly on in the background. So I encourage you to first pay attention to these things, because these really are the barriers to self-compassion. Because whatever the inner critic is serving up, it thinks it is playing an important role, and it has a job to do. And it is not going to easily be dissuaded when you say, like, oh, I'm going to be compassionate to myself. And the inner critic is going to have something to say about that too. So sharing some time with the inner critic, not necessarily believing what it's saying, but sharing some space with it to get really familiar and clear about it can be really useful, because it will be a barrier for self-compassion. And sometimes you'll notice that it reminds you of somebody, either in how it sounds or what it's saying. And if that's the case, sort of, it's a little bit playful, but it can be helpful to give it a name, particularly if it reminds you of somebody, or somebody who was always, like, oh, there's Grandpa Frank again, like, who, maybe had the best of intentions, but there's some messaging there that got inculcated along the way. And so sometimes giving it a name so that you can begin to relate to it, which creates a little bit of space in us so that we're not so fused with the voice as truth and absolute.
I think Sue's comment in the chat is very astute. She says that she thinks her inner critic is trying to protect her, and just not in a very compassionate way. I think that's so astute and so insightful.
Yeah,
because that's exactly what I think that's exactly what most of our kind of inner critic is trying to do, is protect us from being hurt or feeling sad.
Yeah. And this recognition that it may not be in a very compassionate way, right? I mean, that is the most inner critics have are a little thorny and spiky, if you will, right? And have that good intention, again, to make us better, to make us feel like we're still striving and still okay. But the residue, because of it not being in a very compassionate way, the residue of, like, what is the cost of that protection? Often that cost of that protection is is a pretty heavy price tag. And, that can take the form of guilt. That can take the form of shame, particularly in healthcare. I mean, we can all sort of look at these images, right, and see an unwelcome outcome. We can see a hardship. We can see a suffering. And when you see any of these images, anyone that sort of like calls to you, what do you notice in yourself? What do you feel in your body? What do you feel like is your impulse to do for any one of these people? I feel like this, the little guy with the F on his paper, I feel like, I just want to go hug him, or to like take that F and make, I don't know, a clown out of that face, or sort of, draw something around the F and make a garden. I feel like I feel some pull to care for him in some way. What else is coming up for people?
I find that there is a desire to reach out physically, put my hand on the guy's shoulder who's in scrubs, or my hand on the head of the little kid with the F, or just some kind of contact, make physical contact.
Yeah. Other people noticing anything? I mean, we can appreciate these as reflections of distress, right? I mean, there's something quite universal, right, about the hand on the head, the downward, pulling the chin towards the chest, averting the eyes, right? There's something very human and very universal about that gesture, right? We see that, we know that as distress. We may not know all the inner words, but we know that as distress. And what I think none of us would want for any of these people in this moment of suffering or moment of objective failure, if you will, failure to make the soccer point, failure in a athletic sense, failure in a medical sense or academic. I don't think any of us would want or would say to any of these people, well, yeah, because you're not good enough. You're not competent. You're just not hitting the mark. Of course you messed up. Like, do any of us feel called to say that or do that? Like, I don't think so, right? Not at all. We can recognize that that might be the internal process, but we can see it so clearly when it comes to other people, right? We wouldn't be saying to them something like that. And yet, you know, these are the things that come up inside of our own heads about ourselves in these moments. And I offer this just as this really hopefully tangible recognition of this difference, right? Of what will we be called to do in this situation? What we would think would be so unhelpful is like to remind people like, yeah, you're just not that great of a soccer player. Nah, you're probably going to struggle in school all your life, right? Like we wouldn't say that to somebody, and we certainly wouldn't want somebody to be saying that to themselves. And yet, to be honest about how reflexive that is internally to us. And that this is really the offer of self-compassion. It's like, how do you meet these difficult moments? How do you do that? So the practice that I presented in the webinar part was this practice of RAIN by Tara Brach, which is in her book on radical compassion. And it's to recognize, you know, this follows along the textbook definition of compassion, right? To recognize what's happening, to not jump in and alleviate it, to just bring that spirit of allowing and curiosity, and then be willing to ask the question, sort of, what is called for now? How do I nurture, in this case, myself? And if it's helpful to think about, right, the little boy with the F, or somebody not, you know, doing well in an athletic pursuit, or you know, a clinician who had a bad outcome, even just a flash to think like, oh, how would I meet that? And can I U-turn and meet myself in that same way? So I think we'll just practice a little bit. We have a little bit of time. So I'd love for all of you to maybe think about a time in the past 2 weeks when you were distressed. And it may be something that's still really distressing you now. And I'm going to invite you to close your eyes to do this, because sometimes when we drop out of a lot of visual stimuli, we can have a more textured and rich perspective on our inner life. So if you're willing to just think about a time in the last 2 weeks when you were really distressed, you may even be there now. As best you can, imagine the setting. Maybe any sounds or smells that were there. So not something 10 out of 10, a little bit more moderate, maybe a 5 or 6 out of 10 of level of distress. And then see if you can notice what was happening for you in that moment of distress. Was the inner critic acting up? Can you access anything about what that voice might have been saying to you? And the invitation here is, can you U-turn and ask yourself, how would I meet somebody that I care about in this moment? What might I say to them? And how might I be saying that? Can I do that for myself? What might have been the way to care for myself in this moment? Whether that's what you did or not. But beginning to think, oh, how could I nurture myself? Knowing that this distress is here. What really serves me best? Not to directly fight with that inner critic, but because I'm feeling distressed, what might really nurture me? And can I offer myself that kindness, even if it's just a word or a phrase or a touch, a hand on your heart, or a gentle holding and hug of yourself? If you were able to play along, if you will, would anybody be willing to now share what that experience was like, whether you were able to access it and whether you were able to maybe think about a way to nurture yourself? And you can write it in the chat if you want. This is a tough, it can be a really tough exercise because we're so used to talking about and accustomed to dialoguing about, things that aren't going well. So yeah, Carrie asks, how do we stop trying to fix things and offer solutions? It's so tempting as a provider to end up down this road. Yeah, Carrie, it's not only tempting, it's in some ways what the instruction has been. And I think that's really, really tough when, particularly through a lot of education and training, the instruction really has been to fix and to be solution focused and solution oriented. And so you're really combating not only a culture, but an internalized perspective on what the job is and kind of on what's right. So, so the first instruction I would have in terms of how to stop that is actually self-compassion. Is first to know, like, oh yeah, right. Of course, I'm in this churn of fixing because that's what I've been kind of instructed to do, and sometimes it's hugely rewarding because every so often, right, we nail it, and it really does fix a problem, and that feels really good. So. And that intermittent reinforcement can continue, but it comes again at a cost of all the times we are trying to fix when that's not what's called for. And it sets us up to feel defeated because if our source of satisfaction and meaning in our work is so contingent upon the outcome in so many places where a lot of us work in healthcare, that's a really tough equation to write because the math just doesn't add up all the time. So the first thing I say is like self-compassion, to know that you come by that very honestly based on this educational and mentoring path. And then the second invitation is to pause, even if it's, 1 out of 10 times, to pause and to notice that leaning in comes with, right, a desire to fix rather than curiosity. And so as soon as we can pause and become aware and make some space for curiosity, then we will actually be in a much better position, and probably ultimately a much more effective position for other people and ultimately for ourselves to turn towards that. Joan, do you have any other thoughts about that?
No, I just, every time we talk about this, every time I hear you talk about this, I go back to, why is this so hard? Why is this so hard? And, what I talk about with my clients a lot of times is that we have to give our minds the language. Mm-hmm. We have to actually insert the language in there, and we have to practice, because our minds have had so much practice with this kind of harsh inner critic. And so the self-compassion, growing that muscle, does take practice, and actually coming up with, whether it's simple affirmations that when you find yourself, I'm just thinking about how hard this is, and like thinking about simple affirmations that you find yourself, that you can kind of insert in there every time you find yourself saying like, not a nice thing, that you actually, it takes intention. Mm-hmm. And so I just like, mindfulness is a practice. And as you do more of it, as you have more experience in noticing and bringing self-compassion to the present moment, same thing with what we're talking about today.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. It really reflects what Amy is writing too, is just this allowing, right? Allow myself time. And for most of us, time is a incredibly rare and precious resource in the work that we do, and it can often feel like there isn't any. And so, with practice, like what Joan said, sort of with intention and with practice, this can begin to feel like the new normal. But yeah, it is hard. It's not easy. So worth it. But not easy.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. I guess just the other thought I was having was, okay, so we're all healthcare professionals here today, and how do we apply this to our clinical practice? Mm-hmm. And if you have any pearls for when this might apply, or how to just translate that into our work day?
Yeah, so these are kind of some core things that I think about, of these sort of core questions. A very quick application is just, right, how do I treat, or what would I say, or how would I be with a friend in the same situation? How can I best take care of myself in a moment of suffering? And again, if that's in your work day, right, how can I best take care of myself is not like, I'm going to quit the rest of my afternoon and go get a massage. Like that's a lot of time, the misapplication when people say, oh, I'm going to be self-compassionate. And, I'm just going to like leave my clinic in the afternoon and take care of myself. I'm really talking about internal. I mean, it really starts with an internal conversation and what I would call micro practices. So when I think about how can I best take care of myself, it might be actually some very simple physiological things that actually help your nervous system calm. So how can you do that with touching yourself, asking for a hug from somebody if that feels safe in this time of COVID, noticing that inner critic, but sort of being able to say to yourself, I will literally say to myself now, like, it's okay, right? It's not that big of a deal. It will be okay. And sometimes I'll say that internally, and because now I'm home and alone, often I will say that externally, with the same voice, right? That I would meet that little boy who got an F on a paper with the same voice. Other kinds of things like a phrase, a mantra, like Joan said, of just sort of a quick phrase and a word that maybe you don't even believe all the time, but that as you start to say it will become part of your way of relating to yourself. There are other kinds of sensory things that actually can just soothe us. So is why people might use essential oils at work, kind of a sniffer essential oil, for example, some lotion that smells good can actually create that scent experience as well as touch. So some lotion. Poetry is a very common go-to for me. David White says poetry is language against which we have no defense, right? So if poetry is your jam and you can read a brief poem that speaks to your heart, that can be very effective in the moment. So there's ways to work with our nervous system around that I would strongly recommend as micro practices in the moment. And then the one thing that I love also for health professionals is this question, which is not a moment of suffering question, but it's a reorientation question. Because we're always so willing to go to the thing that didn't go well today. And so at the end of your day, what is one thing I did well today? What's one thing that I did well? And to say that to yourself, ideally first, and maybe even to say it to somebody else. And that just begins to incline our minds towards recognizing that, that there are some good things too. And I know we're at or over time. So I'm happy to engage in more dialogue with any of you, but I'll turn it over to Carmen for the admin stuff.
Thank you so much. Sorry for just prompting the screen like that. So quickly, we will email you the instructions, the slides, and the recording link. Please claim your certificate to complete the program evaluation. The activity code expires in 1 week. I'll share it with you right now. And any questions, please feel free to email me. We are going to be having the series again. It's a new series. The two topics are new as well. And here we can see it. It's going to be focused on mindful practice and communication. I'm going to be sending the invitation for registration soon. Here you can see the activity code. Please write it down. And it's only valid for 1 week. And thanks to our speakers for sharing their time and knowledge with us. Thanks to all of you for participating. And you have now completed the session. And we hope you'll join us for the next series. And you may disconnect now. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Be well.
Thank you, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye.